Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Friday, a fifth week here at the Oxford Union. My name is James Price. I'll be interviewing Dr. Debra So, who's a former sex researcher and journalist and the author of The End of Gender. Debra will be giving a little talk in just a second, and it will be covering some of the interesting reports that came out when that our whole term card was announced, and that Debra would be speaking. And so, Debra, we're very happy to have you here to have, I think, a very important and timely conversation. And I'd like to ask you now to give some opening remarks, and I think that covers some of those initial student newspaper reports, and then we'll get into a conversation.
It's been a dream of mine for many years to speak at the Oxford Union. I want to start by saying thank you to President James Price for inviting me to speak today and for upholding that invitation in the face of pressure to rescind it. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here virtually with all of you, to defend the scientific research that I cite in my book, The End of Gender, and to address the concerns of those who disagree with me. I've been following the turn of events in the last few weeks. I understand that in addition to students petitioning to have me deplatformed, a task force was put together in preparation of this event, and the union treasurer resigned to protest the invitation extended to yours truly. It may surprise some of you to know that although I am very critical of woke activism today, I was once very much in favor of social justice, so I can understand where the students who wanted this event canceled are coming from. If students genuinely believe that a speaker is coming to campus to spread hate and to harm marginalized communities, then of course they'll want to stop that speaker from being given a platform. If someone like me had come to campus back when I was an undergraduate student, I probably would have tried to cancel myself. But free debate and discussion must be allowed, even for people with whom we disagree. In this case, pretending that the facts I cite don't exist doesn't make them go away. Ignoring the truth doesn't make one's argument stronger. If anything, it will do a disservice to the communities that activists claim to be protecting. My sense is, however, that most of my critics have not actually read my book or anything I've written in full. In many cases, the things I say are taken out of context. In other cases, critics will claim I've said something that I would never say. I would ask that everyone please read my book and watch my media appearances in their entirety before coming to any conclusions about me or what I have to say. First and foremost, I always want to emphasize that I support transgender rights and the rights of intersex people, the rights of gender nonconforming people, and anyone who feels different. I believe that gender dysphoria is a real phenomenon and that we should empathize with those who are struggling. I support equal rights and legal protections for these communities, and I support gender transitioning in adults. I will use the pronouns someone would like me to use, including third gender pronouns. I always want to be explicitly clear that none of the information I discuss should be used to justify discrimination. I sought to make this very clear when I was writing The End of Gender, and it is something I think about before every media appearance that I do. I do believe that transgender people face prejudice in society and that we should do everything we can to eliminate transphobia. It's been a relief to hear from those who have read my book because they hear this message. I've had people reach out to me, including trans people, telling me that they weren't at first sure what to expect from the book. Some were concerned that it was going to be a polemic or that it would be hateful and extreme. But then they read it and they found it to be compassionate and reasonable, and they can't understand why people are so upset by the things I say. I also have had many trans people reach out to me, thanking me for giving a voice to their concerns. I am not transgender, so I never want to come across as though I'm speaking for the community. But from what I've seen, trans activists do not accurately reflect the concerns of everyday transgender people, who are, in many cases, quite horrified by the things that activists and their allies are demanding in the name of the community. For those of you who are seeing me for the first time, I'll speak briefly about why I made the decision to leave academia. In the final years of my PhD, I had noticed that the climate had shifted. I saw my academic colleagues in sex research increasingly avoiding certain areas of study out of fear that they might anger transgender activists. I had written an op-ed speaking to the scientific research showing that the majority of children with gender dysphoria outgrow their feelings by puberty. They are more likely to grow up to be gay in adulthood, not transgender. At the time, I was using brain imaging techniques, including functional MRI and structural MRI, to better understand human sexuality, including sexual orientation, gender, and paraphilias, which are unusual sexual preferences, also known as kinky sex. For those of you watching right now with children in the room, don't worry, I will keep this talk very PG so that you won't have to get up and move. As a liberal, I was concerned to see how left-leaning science denial was slowly taking over the field. And I knew that I would have to leave academia if I published this op-ed because tenure would not protect me from the backlash. After deliberating for 6 months, I made the decision to publish it. I left academia to become a journalist so that I could write accurately about the scientific research. A year later, I began writing a weekly column for Playboy.com as their resident sex scientist, and I've never looked back since. I wrote The End of Gender to answer all of the questions my readers have been asking me over the years. It has become next to impossible to determine legitimate scientific studies from activist propaganda, and as a result, the public is understandably confused. Most people are not ideological. They simply want to know what the truth is. What is particularly worrisome is that this activism is being branded as the quote-unquote newest science. Indeed, some scientists have chosen to jump on the social justice bandwagon, either because they are afraid of retribution if they don't, or because they know that going along with wokeism will help to further their careers. In The End of Gender, I discuss 9 different myths that have come to be accepted at face value in our society, even though they are not factually true. These myths include the idea that gender and sex are spectrums, that sexual orientation and gender identity are unrelated, and that there are no differences between trans women and women who were born women. But I don't just pick on trans activists in my book. Just when I thought I'd made enough people angry, I also included a chapter defending evolutionary psychology when it comes to dating and sex, and chapters speaking to the science that shows that gender is not a social construct. Many of these myths were ideas I once believed myself, but I eventually changed my mind about them after learning about the science. Most importantly, I included all of the citations to the research in my book so that it can be used as a resource to better understand these issues. Readers don't have to take my word about anything. They can look up the studies and make up their own mind. For instance, much confusion exists around the terms sex and gender. Sex is determined by gametes, which are mature reproductive cells. There are eggs and there are sperm. Gender identity refers to how we feel in relation to our sex. The majority of us identify as our birth sex. Transgender people and some intersex people identify as the opposite sex. In some cases, a person will identify as a third gender. Biological sex has, however, become verboten because it's been deemed hateful. Activists believe that any reference to it undermines trans rights. But if biological sex didn't exist, what would be the purpose of transitioning? What would transgender people be transitioning from and to? In the case of intersex people who possess both female and male anatomy, we can advocate for their bodily autonomy and against unwanted surgeries in intersex children without denying sex categories as a concept. In other situations, as we've seen, the word gender has been replaced by the word sex in order to facilitate this acceptance. If we look at US President Joe Biden's executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation, the word sex is frequently used when the more appropriate term would be gender identity. Instead of acknowledging that trans women are individuals who identify as female, it would appear that trans women are female based on biology. From a scientific standpoint, a person can change their gender identity, but they cannot change their sex. To claim otherwise is not factually accurate. Furthermore, if anyone could become biologically female, any distinction pertaining to sex-based rights becomes meaningless. I understand activists' concern because it can feel insensitive to reference a trans person's birth sex. In some cases, and I don't agree with this, people will refuse to refer to a trans person as the sex they identify as. I would argue we can advocate for trans rights without pretending that biology and sex don't exist. If anything, I think denying this reality will turn the average person away from supporting trans rights because they know that biology and sex exist, and it comes across as dishonest to suggest otherwise. These policies have real implications for people's lives. In the realm of sport, the public is being told that trans female athletes do not possess an unfair advantage when competing in women's sports. However, research has shown that even after being on cross-sex hormones for a year, this does not reduce muscle size or strength. Individuals born male are, on average, stronger, faster, and larger than those born female. I understand that sport is about more than competition. In many cases, it's about belonging and sharing a sense of community. And I feel uncomfortable pointing these things out, as I never want to seem as though I'm telling individuals who they really are. But at the elite level, it isn't appropriate to ignore these differences. Young female athletes especially are being negatively affected by these policies. In some cases, they have been training their entire lives for the opportunity to compete, only to know the outcome of the competition before it's even started. This ideology also has implications for language. Words referring to womanhood and female bodies are one by one being erased. Women are now referred to as, quote, individuals with a cervix, birthing people, uterus havers, and people who bleed. We can be sensitive in our choice of language without forbidding any reference to being female. I now want to touch upon some of the criticisms raised about my work. The most prominent one would probably be my defense of the desistance literature. As I mentioned earlier, all of the available research shows that children with gender dysphoria are more likely to grow up to be gay, not transgender. But activists will pick apart these studies, calling them outdated, saying that desistance is a myth. In my book, I go into greater detail as to why these criticisms fall short. Activists are essentially asking us to ignore a finding backed by all of the scientific research in favor of an idea that is backed by none of it. Another point of contention has been my criticism of conversion therapy bans for gender identity. It's important to point out that sexual orientation and gender identity are related, but they aren't the same thing. I do not support conversion therapy for sexual orientation because sexual orientation is immutable. Attempts to make someone who is gay or bisexual become straight are not ethical because they do not work. Gender identity, however, is not the same as sexual orientation. It can fluctuate, especially in children, because they haven't finished developing. If the vast majority of them will outgrow their gender dysphoria, it doesn't make sense for them to transition before puberty. I do think for the small percentage of children who will persist, transitioning can help them. But because of the current climate, clinicians cannot do a proper assessment to make this distinction. In Canada, we have a bill that will criminalize any therapeutic interventions that do not facilitate early transitioning. In the US, conversion therapy bans exist in 20 states. As a result, those working in the field have one of two choices. They can go along with accepted narratives, or they can lose their job. I sympathize with the underlying sentiment because there has been a history of gatekeeping for trans people, which made it harder for them to access the care and support they deserve. But the solution is not to go completely in the other direction, taking every wish to transition at face value. As a straight woman who grew up in the gay community, I find this very upsetting because I consider this movement to be a new form of conversion therapy. I've had many gay adults reach out to me saying that they see themselves in these children. I've also had many gay men tell me that after reading my work years ago, they changed their minds about transitioning and now they live happily as gay men. Also, contrary to what the public is being told, a child's social transition isn't harmless or easily reversed. Allowing a child to change their name and clothing and live as the opposite sex is associated with continuing on to medical transition. It's not as though a child will make the decision to go back to living as their birth sex at any point in time. Some people have been upset at me for saying there are only two genders, but I will say it again. There are only two genders. People can identify however they like, but from a scientific perspective, there are only two. The desire to identify as non-binary or a gender other than male or female usually stems from a variety of other issues in a person's life, like experiencing sexism or homophobia, which are issues that should be talked about instead of being swept under the rug. Because this ideology targets young people, it has convinced many girls that if they aren't stereotypically feminine, or if they don't enjoy being sexualized in our culture, this means they aren't female. I would have less of an issue with this gender experimentation if it didn't involve, in many cases, double mastectomies and taking testosterone. There needs to be more of a dialogue with young women to say to them, it's okay to feel different. It doesn't mean you're not a woman. I'm sure those of you in the United Kingdom have been following Kira Bell's lawsuit against a Tavistock clinic. Bell is a detransitioner who once identified as male. She was on puberty blockers and testosterone, had a double mastectomy at the age of 20, and has since returned to living as female. In December of last year, the High Court ruled that children under 16 cannot consent to puberty blockers. The UK is waking up to this sooner than those of us in North America. Detransitioners continue to be ignored currently, but I have no doubt that there will be many more of them in the future. This opens up the conversation about rapid onset gender dysphoria. Many young women will identify as male or a third gender very suddenly and often out of the blue when there are other issues influencing their decision to do so, including being on the autism spectrum, a history of sexual trauma, comorbidity like anxiety, mood, and personality disorders, or discomfort in their bodies that is typical of growing up. I've been quoted as saying that autism is a mental health condition, and I stand by that because autism spectrum disorder is listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM. Regarding this correlation between autism and gender dysphoria, a recent study published by Professor Simon Baron-Cohen in the journal Nature, which is one of the most prestigious academic journals in the world, included a sample of over 600,000 people and found elevated rates of autistic traits in transgender and gender diverse individuals. This is not to say that people with autism who experience gender dysphoria should not transition, but it's an important factor for clinicians to know when someone is considering it. I strongly believe that people on the spectrum and those with gender dysphoria deserve support and love and should not be treated any differently from anyone else. Being pro-science means supporting science, even if it disagrees with your personal beliefs. Cancel culture has become a huge problem in academia. I dedicate an entire chapter in my book to this. Scientists should not have to face being silenced, intimidated, or defamed as a result of doing ethical work. We will see the ramifications of ignoring this research in the years to come. Thank you to everyone who made my talk today possible and to the students at Oxford who reached out to me voicing your support. I look forward to your questions.
Debra, thank you very much for that. There's an awful lot to go into, and I'll say to everybody as we get started that there is a Q&A function at the bottom, and people please do submit questions. There are already some sensible ones in there, and just to anyone anonymous in there who feels like they're putting something silly in there, that it obviously reflects a lot more on you than it does on anybody else. And one of the other things that I want to get into a lot of is Molly Mantle, my librarian-elect, has put together some quotes on certain things that you've written that we'd like to get your sort of take on. And actually, you've covered quite a lot of them in there as well. But I want to get the kind of the conversation started. It seems to me that the people who think that you're some hate-filled person, and that initial talk didn't sound to me like that's the sort of person that you are. They think that they are, and in many cases they are, people who care a great deal about people being allowed to live their own lives the way they choose, and that opponents of trans rights or any of these sorts of things are either bigots or transphobes themselves or any of these kinds of things. And you described yourself in your talk just then as a liberal, as someone who wants people to be able to live their own lives. So is this a clash of two sides of people who both feel that they are themselves the sort of the liberal and trying to help ward off others who are violating the harm principle? Is that the nub of this?
I think there are a number of factors. I think for many people, yes, they are compassionate. They want to protect as I mentioned, marginalized communities. They want to protect people who do face discrimination. And as I mentioned, I do think transgender people face discrimination in society. And I think we should work toward ending that. And we should be concerned about that. And I am very concerned about that. And I took that into consideration the entire time I was writing my book. Anytime I talk about the research literature, I'm very aware that the things I say, I need to be responsible with them. So I think on some level, many people aren't aware that the scientific research actually does not support a lot of the narratives that are put out in the mainstream in terms of what you read in news coverage, in terms of what experts even will say, because some experts feel that they need to go along with these narratives. They fear losing their jobs. In other cases, they know, as I mentioned, that it's going to help their careers to go along with it. So I think many people, especially those who are on the left side of the political spectrum, feel that if they're in support of these groups, then they must go along with these narratives. Even if they know to some extent that they may not necessarily be true, they feel like that's the right thing to do. But I argue that by pretending that this science doesn't exist or denying the science outright is not going to help these communities, because it makes it seem as though the activism is dishonest. It makes it look as though the activism is trying to trick people or pull one over on them. And I think also there can be some nuance in this conversation to say that the science, once you do learn about it and you realize that the science actually doesn't back up many of the narratives or the orthodoxy, to say we can acknowledge this, but still be in favor of transgender rights, intersex rights. It's the two things are not incompatible. But I think the way it's presented to the public is that if you are in favor of these rights, you have to agree with all these tenets.
I think a lot of people who would disagree with that, to push back on it, when it comes to adults at least, and we'll talk about children and things at the Tavistock Centre later, even if these things you say in the science isn't true, we can get onto that as well. What's the harm in people acting the way they want to and saying that these things are right? You may not think it's true, but lots of us go around our lives with fictions in our heads. Some may say religion. I may think that I'm very handsome walking around when it's not the case, all these sorts of things. So why does it matter? Why does it matter to you, or why should it matter to people watching, how people choose to identify, or if they want to say that they are non-gender binary or any of these other sort of words that have come into play recently?
Well, even in the case of adults, I mean, the climate right now in terms of therapy is so political that even adults cannot get unbiased treatment. If they go in, a clinician has to affirm any desire to transition, or even if someone is just questioning their gender, a clinician has to affirm them. And for some adults, yes, I do think transitioning can help, but that's not the case for everyone. And you will see even adults detransitioning later in life because they will realize that transition was not right for them. There were other issues under the surface that were not being dealt with. And the thing with transition is the hope is that if someone does make this decision, that it's going to make them feel better. That's the ideal outcome. But if there are other issues beneath the surface that are not being dealt with, as I mentioned, if there are other psychopathology, then those issues are going to remain even after someone transitions. So the job of a therapist, a good therapist, is to sit down and determine, is transitioning really going to help you feel better? Are there other things that should be looked at? And I'm not saying just because there is I don't do clinical work anymore, so I don't work with these patients, but just because there is psychopathology, I mean, if I were to speak with my colleagues, I think they would agree, those who do clinical work, psychopathology doesn't necessarily rule out transitioning, but it's a factor to take into consideration, because in some cases, if someone is struggling with other mental health conditions, the desire to transition may be a symptom of that other mental health condition. So if that's the case, then it probably makes more sense to look at the initial underlying issue first to see, can this be dealt with in a way? Can you feel better once we target this? And then we'll talk about the gender aspect. But because that doesn't exist, I mean, they can't even ask these questions now because that's considered hateful. Or as I mentioned, in Canada, it's about to be criminalized. So someone will face up to 5 years in prison for doing so potentially. I mean, it's not going to lead to good outcomes for even adults. And I mean, to go about, I mean, you could, I guess it depends on also how you want to live your life and your outlook. I think most of us would want to live in reality. I guess not everyone feels that way. Maybe some people would prefer to have their own ideas about the world and just believe that those are the ideas that are true, despite what evidence shows. And I guess that that is their right to do so. But I would argue if you are misinformed, you're not going to have a very, I would say, meaningful life, because again, the way you view the world is not based in truth or actuality.
So do you think then that this sounds a little bit more like almost like a paternalistic argument coming through, where it's two kinds of liberals, again, as I asked in my first question, of one of some people saying, why can't people just do what they like? And maybe not in just the clinical setting that you talked about, but say people who are questioning how they want to live their lives and who they want to be and these sorts of things, and then decide to wear different clothes and present as a different gender or things like that. And then the kinds of harm that they suffer, the sorts of bullying and the pile-ons on social media and things like that. And I know obviously that you would say you wouldn't advocate for those sorts of piles-on, but there is a kind of the corollary of your quoting science at people and quoting research and things like that. Lots of people watching might think, or some people watching might think that those sorts of things are less important than someone's lived experience, or that the way they want to live in the world. What would you say to those sorts of arguments?
Right. And I can understand that, because especially when I'm citing scientific research, I don't ever want it to come across as patronizing, or I hope it doesn't, or that it comes across as elitist. This is something I've spent, I mean, the only reason I know any of this is because I've spent many years studying it, and because this is my job. So I fully don't hold that against anyone who may not have a scientific background and may not know about the research. But again, it comes from wanting to understand the truth. And I don't think those two things are necessarily incompatible, in terms of saying people can live their lives, but here's some information that might help you live a happier, more meaningful, satisfying life. And I definitely am not in favor of, as you mentioned, the mobbing, the bullying. I think for anyone who's different, I understand that sentiment of, for sure, people who are different, even people who are mildly gender atypical, can face harassment, can face serious, stigma in society. I don't think that's right. But I think we can advocate for both and say, the science I talk about, or the facts I talk about, aren't incompatible with people living their lives freely. I'm not sure if that addresses your point. I think it's an important point to make. My sense is it's quite illiberal to me, the people who are saying, let's not talk about the science. You have no right to talk about this. Let's shut you down and say that you're not allowed to speak, and lived experience is more important. Even though, I mean, I understand that perspective, and I do try to take that feedback into consideration when people talk about their personal experiences in life, because I think it's important to be sensitive to that. But let's be honest, sometimes the lived experience is not, I mean, it's subjective, whereas science is objective. And I think there's a clash there too in the conversation, where some people feel that subjective experience should trump objective reality. And I mean, I think we can be sympathetic without saying that subjectivity should trump objectivity.
Thank you. And I suppose one of the other questions that comes into these sorts of things is about people's motives in wading into these sorts of arguments. And so your background was in doing this sort of sex research and things in an academic perspective, and other people have got involved in this argument without that kind of background. So the kind of people like J.K. Rowling, I suppose, is a big example. So I suppose my question is, what was you talked a little bit about the lack of objectivity in some of the scientific research and things like tenure not protecting you, but why would you not just go for an easier life than touching on these issues? And that includes talking about autism as well as some of these other things. And because people say, well, when you put your head above the parapet like that, it's actually because you want to discriminate against people or whatever else it may be. And the same kind of case with J.K. Rowling. And then it's a very quick elision to saying, well, it's actually just because you're a transphobe. So what's your, I suppose the short question is, what was your motivation for this? And if I were being less charitable, people would say it's just because you have a problem with these sorts of people living this way.
Well, no one can read my mind. At the end of the day, only I know my thoughts, and I know that I'm coming to this discussion with good intentions, with a good heart. And so I think that's part of why I continue despite the backlash that I face as well, because I know that I have only love for these communities, for trans people, for anyone who is different. My concern is seeing how politics is essentially taking over my former field of sex research. And as I mentioned, this is something I noticed when I was still in school. I didn't ever anticipate that it was going to be as bad as it's gotten, and it's continuing to get worse. And I took a lot of pride in being a sex researcher. It's very difficult work to do. My colleagues do excellent work. In many cases, their work is not given the weight it should, simply because it is about human sexuality, and human sexuality is considered stigmatized, unfortunately, in our society. So I think it's part of that stemming from having been a scientist and seeing how rigorous science is as a method. And I think it's partially also my personality to some extent. I feel I do try to take criticisms on board. And I always, as I wrote in the book, I generally try to read all the comments. I look at all the feedback on social media, because I do want to know that I have a point and that I'm right and that I'm not missing something, because I think the only way you can know that is to engage with the other side. And what I find concerning is a lot of the people who don't like me, don't like my work, will just call me names and think that they can call it a day. That doesn't disprove anything I'm saying. And for anyone who does know the scientific research, they know that you calling me names doesn't disprove the research. So it doesn't seem to be, I welcome, as we're discussing and debating now, I'm happy to do this, because this is the way to show, and even impartial onlookers can see that we can have a discussion about it. And even if they disagree with me, well, they might come away with some new information, or to consider things in a way that they hadn't previously. But I'm concerned about that too, because I feel that this climate, because people are afraid of being called transphobic, they're afraid of being called bigoted, they're afraid of being called all these other nasty names. So that puts them off of wanting to touch it. So I guess when someone like me continues, they think, well, why isn't she afraid of being called those names? And it's just because I know they have no basis in calling me those things.
Yeah, I think some of the best bits of advice I've ever been given was never read the comment section of anything. So it seems very interesting that you have, out of those comments then, and we've talked before this about some of the kind of ridiculous sort of abuse that you get. And as you say, that people just kind of think it's enough of a day's work to send you a bunch of swear words and horrible names and then move on as if that's kind of case closed. But what good arguments counter to your own position have you found then, either in those comments or in emails from people or in discussions and things like that? If what are the strongest arguments to steel man against your own that you've come across?
Probably around childhood transition. The people will point out to me the persistence rate. So across all the research, we have approximately 60 to 90, so 60 to 90% of children desist. Children with gender dysphoria will no longer feel dysphoric by the time they reach puberty. But that still leaves a percentage of children who will persist, and they will say to me, what about those kids? So I do always emphasize when I talk about this that I care as much about those children as well. I do think that they should be able to access care if they reach puberty and they are persisting in their dysphoria, because a lot of these decisions are time sensitive. But the problem is with the climate, again, with clinicians not being able to do proper assessments, they really can't tell when a child comes to them which category or which path will be best for that child. They aren't able to monitor that development in a way that is critical. So I still feel that my position stands in that, again, until the research shows us something completely different, which in today's climate, I won't be surprised if research coming out now starts to show that early transitioning is best for all children. The thing is, I don't think it would even be possible to do an objective study now, because what you would have to do if you're doing this scientifically is you would have to take a group of kids with gender dysphoria and you would have to randomly assign them to either treatment or control. And that's considered completely unethical. So until you're able to do that, and then you would follow them over time and see, of the ones who were randomly assigned to transition, do they consistently have better outcomes than the children who were randomly assigned to the control group who did not undergo any form of treatment? That kind of a study would never happen. So, I think with any other issue, you would look at the available research. The body of research that we do have, all of these studies, they stretch back to the 70s. It doesn't matter where in the world they're done, which research team, how large or small the sample sizes are. I go through all of this in one of the chapters in my book. It's a consistent finding. And so it really doesn't make sense. Why would we dismiss this finding? The only reason it's being dismissed is because it doesn't fit a particular narrative. And I do understand, because I think for those who are concerned, they may be coming from a place of saying, well, can this research not then be used to deny everyone the right to transition, including adults, to say, if people outgrow it, change their minds, why should we let anyone transition? But I do argue in the book as to why I think transitioning for adults helps and can help. And again, I think it just has to be a much more nuanced conversation instead of these sweeping statements.
Thank you. And I think that there is that 60% number is sort of disputed because the criteria were different when it was done originally. I think that was in some of the as you mentioned before, the task force that was put to me. So I suppose it's, again, as you say, it's jolly difficult to get these kinds of accurate numbers without putting people through, I suppose, human trials like that.
But even I have to say with that, even with that criticism, that is a very common criticism. Even if you go into those studies, which include the children who did not meet the more stringent criteria, and remove those children, the numbers from the studies, you still see a desistance rate of approximately either 50% or 80%, depending on the study. That criticism does not hold. It is constantly repeated just because it's something that is really widely spread in mainstream news, but it does not hold. And I mean, anyone can go in and do the math themselves, as I did. You just subtract those numbers from the final statistic, and so no, that doesn't hold.
Sure. And on this point about children, so we talked about adults and things like that, and I'm really interested because, as you said, that you call yourself a liberal, talking about the harm principle here, and I wonder if it, again, we'll just get down to a kind of crude utilitarian argument that X more children will be harmed by not letting them transition than if you let too many transition and then have to kind of go back again. Could you talk a little bit about this with children, and maybe again with reference, you talked about the Tavistock Centre before, what was happening there, what was wrong with that perhaps, and what you think a better solution would be?
Social transition, as I mentioned in my talk, is being sold to the public as completely harmless because people will say there is no medical intervention involved. So what's the harm in letting a child live as the opposite sex? It could be a temporary thing, and then they may change their mind. But the thing is, research has shown that for kids who socially transition, so even if there are no medical interventions at the time, so social transition is when they take on a new name, take on new pronouns, they live as the opposite sex, they'll often change their clothing and their haircut. That is associated with going on to medical interventions. And especially for young children, nowadays, they receive a lot of praise and attention when they do come out as a different gender, whether it's the opposite sex or a third gender. And I think people really don't take into consideration how difficult it can be for a child to turn away from that approval to say, actually, I was wrong. And you all have to now go back to calling me by my original name and referring to me as my birth sex. And so that's one part of it. And also the detransitioners I interviewed for my book would say to me, it's extremely shameful to have to do that. I think people don't really look at what that actually looks like when you live as the opposite sex and then you go back. And then, as well as you mentioned with the clinic, so detransitioners, this is a huge issue that is being completely ignored. These young people are being told either that they're too statistically rare to matter, or that they were never really gender dysphoric. And again, I think it's coming from a place of activists who are afraid that if we acknowledge that some people change their mind about transition, then that's going to be halted for everybody across the board. But the reality is some people make this decision and it's not the right decision to them for them. And I think we can look at that and take that information and use that to help us in terms of better determining who transition is right for. So I think the negatives of this conversation are really being overweighted. I think there can be some positive taken from it. And I also think detransitioners deserve to be supported and to be believed, and their quote unquote lived experience matters just as much as anyone else's. I'm not sure if that gets at all of your points, but I mean, also, so with the especially with medical transition, so if in some cases there are permanent side effects, sterility can result, and especially with double mastectomies, I mean, this is something that's becoming very common for people born female. In some cases, I've heard, under a year for it to happen. It's very quick, and I think if a proper assessment can be done, and this is something that someone has been thinking about for a long time, I'd feel a little more comfortable. But because of the climate and because these decisions are often made very quickly with other issues and other comorbidity, then that to me is a red flag, and it's concerning.
Okay, thank you. We're getting to our sort of last 20 minutes or so, and there are loads of good questions coming in from the audience. So I just before we move on to them all, and I want to get through as many as we can, I want to put some of your words, as I've been asked to do by the task force that was put together to you. And actually, you covered a lot of these in the talk that you've given anyway. And so I don't think any of this is sort of gotcha in any way, kind of asking on things. But so some things on things like testosterone and gender. You said in an LA Times piece that, and I'm reading here, seeking a 50-50 gender quota in STEM is unrealistic, and many studies, for instance, have documented the masculinizing effects of prenatal testosterone on the developing brain. But so some psychological studies have shown the effects of stereotyping to be significant on performance. And there's a report here, Stricker and Ward in 2004, women who tick the female box on SATs before taking them do worse. When you sort of say things like 50-50 gender quota in STEM is unrealistic, is that not you having some kind of, I suppose, what would it be called? The almost internalized misogyny, some people would say, or some kind of problem around that? What would you say to things like that?
Yeah, I've been accused of being a misogynist in the past. I don't think I am. I'm very much in favor of women's rights, equal rights. A lot of the issues I speak about are coming from a place of being concerned about what's happening, especially with young women today. And one point I would make is some of the feedback I've gotten from my book is some people have said to me, they're surprised that The End of Gender has not been considered a really pro-trans book, because I do talk about brain sex, and I do talk about how on average there are biologically based sex differences in the brain. So this does lend support for the argument that someone can be born with potentially the wrong brain in their body. So that's not the case, obviously, for everyone with gender dysphoria, but for some people, I do think that can be one cause or part of the etiology. And so people get upset when I talk about prenatal testosterone, and I always want to emphasize by talking about on average sex differences in the brain that are biological, this does not justify sexism. This does not justify treating women differently or believing that women are inferior or less capable. As a woman with a PhD in a STEM discipline, which is neuroscience, I obviously know that women are very capable. I don't doubt that. Again, I think it's just easy for people to call names, and many people have never even read the research. You cannot read the research on prenatal testosterone and think that it has no merit. There are thousands of studies documenting this. With regard to how it plays out with women in the sciences or in STEM fields, I mean, there are a number of different areas of research that support that there are differences in terms of occupational interests between the sexes. I won't go through all of the details. They're in chapter 2 of my book. But essentially, again, and I defended James Damore's Google memo in 2017, where he talked about differences in interest, not ability. So that's a really clear distinction to make, because much of the media coverage claimed that he said that women were not capable in STEM. That's not what he said. I would never say that either. It's about interest. So on average, women find other disciplines more interesting, people-focused occupations more interesting. Men tend to gravitate more, on average, to mechanically interesting occupations. You can see this.
The response to that, though, would be that why is that useful to point out? Because would that not make it even less likely for people like you have done to go and get a PhD in a STEM subject if you're a woman? If you're a woman, listening to that and saying, well, there's not going to be very many people doing a PhD who look like me or who sound like me or who are a woman like I am, then I shouldn't bother either. What's the usefulness, people would ask, in highlighting some of this stuff again?
Well, because I think the other side of that is making women feel pressured that they have to go into these fields to have a legitimate occupation. And that I think is what the underlying sexism is that young women especially are being told they have to be like men in order to be equal or in order to be taken seriously. And we're not actually challenging the true sexism, which is why is it that feminine occupation, or more I guess female dominated occupations or traits that are stereotypically feminine, why is that considered lesser than? When you're telling someone that you just need to be more like men to be accepted, we're not challenging those ideas. And because also a lot of resources and time and money are going into what's what I'm thinking of, things in university to say recruit women. I think that's great. Initiatives, that's what I was thinking of. Initiatives to recruit women. I think that's great and very important. But at the same time, it's not, if on average women do not find these disciplines as interesting, we're not going to have a 50-50 ratio unless they're actively pushing women to go into those fields. And so I think those resources could be better spent doing other things, maybe improving the program or recruiting, getting more funding. Other things would be more useful use of that time. And also the narrative, I think, is demoralizing to women, because what they're also being told is it's due to sexism. So young women then think, okay, well, there's this uphill battle on top of it if they do decide to go into the field. And they don't look at people like myself and many other, obviously, women who have been successful at attaining higher education in these fields. They're discounting our experiences. And I don't deny that sexism exists, but again, I don't think it's helpful to terrify young women and to tell them that the world is much worse than it is.
And so I think it's sort of on this. You wrote in an LA Times piece that nobody wants to be female typical, not even women. And this will be one of my last questions to you. It gets to some of the heart of some of these sorts of issues of what it is to be a woman. So very recently, the person who won the election for the presidency of the student union here in Oxford, not our debating society, got in trouble and has now since resigned, I think, for saying trans women and women as two separate categories. So you talk about, firstly, could you explain to people who may not know what female typical means in this sense? And when you say nobody wants to be female typical, not even women, what that means? And what it is, I suppose, in general, you think it is to be a woman. Is it someone who is female typical, or is it, as you described yourself before, as a woman who happens to be quite masculine? Does that count? And I think this gets to the heart of this sort of disagreement. So I suppose the question for short is, what is, in your opinion, what is a woman?
So with that piece, my concern is, so I guess what I would consider stereotypically female would be traits that are typically associated with women. So say being more nurturing on average. Again, this is not to say that all women are this way, but women are on average more, say, nurturing, more empathic. And you will see women wanting to distance themselves from that because those traits in some senses are denigrated in society, or they're not valued as much as, say, male typical traits. And so I feel there's, as I mentioned, this pressure for women. They feel that to be taken seriously, they need to be more male typical. And so underlying this whole movement, I sense, is what we're not talking about is there are some women who are struggling with their own, I think, acceptance of being female. And so I push back against that and say, well, let's talk about that. We don't have to feel pressured to be like men or pretend that we are like men or claim that the only reason we are females because society has brainwashed us to be this way. That to me is a more useful conversation. And it also makes me sad to think that there are some women who are not happy about being female. And as I mentioned, with the push for some, not push, but the trend of young women so quickly wanting to live as male, there are some things in society that young women have to deal with that they look around, they see that their male peers don't deal with, and they think, well, I'd have an easier life living like that. I would say also, so my previous comments about being more male typical, so from a young age, I have been more like little boys. I mean, if you look at photos of me, I look like a little boy. But people get upset and they say she's trying to be a cool girl, she's trying to appeal to men. But the reality is, yes, there are some women who just are naturally more male typical. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm not saying that women should want to distance themselves from being female or anything like that. So this conversation, I feel like there are so many points that I always want to try and make sure I address, because there will be someone somewhere who will say, but she didn't say this. But the larger question of what is a woman, we see a lot of this now, where if there's any differentiation between trans women and women who are born women, that people face negative repercussions for it. And I do have a whole chapter about this in my book. I think, me personally, my stance is we can be respectful of trans women, and we should be, and I will use the pronouns someone wants me to use. But at the same time, there are some differences. And I think depending on the context, that should determine how much weight should be placed on those differences. So something like sport, I think it's important to have an honest and open conversation there that is science-based. I think something like prison, where there are situations or environments where women's spaces are very intimate, I think we need to be able to talk about these differences because it has an implication for women who are born women. And there are implications also for trans women as well. But the fact that non-trans women are essentially being told they need to shut up and they're not allowed to voice their opinion or else they're going to face retribution for it, I don't think that's acceptable. Yeah, I think that's...
Thank you. I mean, I wish that we had a lot longer because there are so many other questions to drill down into and some other things to push on. But I'm going to go to as many audience questions as I can, and maybe if we can keep some of the answers shorter, we can get through as many as possible. So Isabel Heinemann asks, do you personally believe there's any hope for your field and for academia more broadly, considering the current climate makes things difficult for you, as you pointed out?
I think it's going to get much worse before it gets better, but I am an optimistic person. I just think at some point, because you cannot hide the truth forever, it will come out. I think eventually all of this ideology is going to cave in on itself and we will have to rebuild things. But I think that will be a much more optimistic and fruitful time.
Thank you. And Lilia Stewart says, hi, Dr. So what's your response to someone like Judith Butler, who argues that gender is a result of historicized patriarchy and a product of power imbalances? In this sense, doesn't only two genders become meaningless?
I never want to attack or criticize. Well, no, I won't criticize her specifically, but I will say I have a lot of people who quote Judith Butler to me in response to my opinions, and I would say, please just go read the scientific papers because those beliefs are not based in any evidence whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. There's so many here to go through. Let me see. Lilia Stewart again asks, most transgender people don't deny biology or the notion of objectivity, and would argue that to suggest so is oversimplifying the issue. Truth is not something that just scientists desire. However, do you not believe that the societal construction of gender over time is too complex to reduce gender merely to biology?
No, I don't think so. Well, I do think that cultural influence can play a role in terms of what is deemed masculine or feminine, but what someone gravitates toward in terms of whether they are masculine or feminine, regardless of their birth sex, is biologically based. So I do talk about this in chapter 2 as well.
Okay, thank you. And we've got Elika Charlton here, who's a long and interesting question, but the nub of it is, doesn't the idea of a gender spectrum allow for women to still be women, but to exist on that spectrum from, say, being a very feminine woman to being a more masculine woman, and then I suppose by corollary, a more feminine man and a more masculine man? What's the problem of conceptualizing gender like that?
I think it's more outdated to say that someone who's gender atypical should be categorized as something other than their birth sex. I don't see why a masculine woman can't still be a woman or a feminine man can't still be a man. To say that someone who is gender atypical must somehow be not what they actually were, what they are, is old. To me, is not. I don't see the point of that. I think it's actually quite regressive.
Okay. Isabel here asks, if the world was not so binary with gender and society didn't enforce such strong gender stereotypes, as Isabella says here that it does, do you think that transitioning would happen as often or even be necessary?
Well, transitioning, one part of the equation has to do with the partners that someone is seeking to attract. So say if someone is, for trans women, say, if they are attracted to very masculine men are sexually interested in women for the most part. Not to say that there aren't some masculine gay men. So I would say no. I mean, from a research perspective, again, it comes down to the kinds of partners someone is seeking to attract. And I do talk about this also chapter 4.
Thank you. We've got Danilo Garrido here, who says about how many Indigenous communities recognize more than two genders. So I suppose part of this question is about whether this is just a sort of, is it weird, Western educated, industrialized sort of that idea of we're being sort of slightly different in the modern West to most other things. So what about that idea that many other Indigenous communities have recognized more than two genders? How does that play, how you think?
There are, I don't deny that there are third gender cultures or that some cultures recognize more than two genders. But again, it comes down to, for the most part, for cultures that recognize a third gender, these individuals would, in what Western context, be considered gay. So they'd either be gay men or women. And I do talk about, I know we're on a time crunch here, so I'm not going to go into all the research, but I'll just refer chapter, I believe it's chapter 4 also in or chapter 3 in my book. I talk about the research there specifically with the Fa'afafine and so this is in Samoa and other countries that have this. So again, to me, it doesn't make sense why we're reconceptualizing gender for the sake of for facilitating acceptance when we can facilitate that acceptance without having to completely rework our culture. I think it's a different ideology that's coming in that's trying to make us rethink and rebuild and destroy everything. That is the reason why people want to do that.
Thank you. I'm aware we've only got a couple of minutes left. There's a question here from Akanksha Awal who says, this is on a slightly different gear. Why are these conversations about gender coming out of Canada so much? So in quotes Jordan Peterson as well. So what is it at the moment that's happening in Canada, that why this is happening? And I suppose to broaden that out, why it is in the sort of Anglosphere where these conversations aren't happening in the same way in, say, the rest of Europe?
I've wondered that myself. I'm not sure. I think Canadians, I mean, Brits also very polite people. So maybe when the case that someone is outspoken about these issues, we seem more aberrant than other people. But I think it's because these are also places in the world where this ideology has picked up the most momentum. So naturally, the pushback against that is, in order to be vocal and to be heard, you're going to need to be a little bit more outspoken. So that would be my guess.
Thank you. Oliver Buckingham asks, if your former fields of research are now incapable of objective study, what do you think the route out of this, as you would put it, I suppose, science denialism? What is the route out, and how do we heal the rifts that these things are growing in society?
I would say, I mean, within sex research, there are some of my colleagues, I respect them immensely. They are still doing good work. They're still being very scientifically minded, and they will face the pushback. They face cancellation attempts constantly. I think that's one way to do it from the inside, until all the good people are either fired or have to quit. And then from the outside, I would just say for the public, please just be as vocal as you can, even with people in your life, because you'd be surprised to know the number of people who actually agree with you, and they're just looking around hoping that someone will say the same thing.
Thank you. I need sort of 2 more questions. We've got to wrap up, but the Oxford Union, as I said to you before we came on, was once described as the last bastion of free speech in the Western world, and free speech arguments have had very, very hot topics on campus, and some people saying that speech does indeed now equate to violence and equal violence. And that if that's the case, then some of your research and some of the things that you've been talking about would be considered almost violence and therefore shouldn't be said. Do you have a comment on that and on the general sort of free speech arguments that are happening on university campuses and beyond as well, as almost evidenced by the difficulties that we've had with getting this debate going?
Right. It's a bit hyperbolic to me when people say that speech is violence. I think that is one way that people can be emotionally, I'm not sure if manipulative is a strong way to describe it, but I think for people who can't actually debate or argue with facts or knowledge, or won't take the time to actually learn about the issue, to simply say that they're offended or that they feel unsafe, the fact that that's actually being considered as equal to knowing what you're talking about, to me, is a huge problem. So I would say for anyone who feels unsafe, you need to grow thicker skin. I'm sorry, but you do. You need to, this is the world that we live in. Not everyone is going to agree with you or capitulate to you, nor should they. And it will make you a stronger person. It will make you more informed. It will help you grow. I promise you.
Thank you. And the sort of the last question I've been asking every speaker that we've had, what is the one thing that we should be talking about or worrying about or looking forward to, but that we aren't? And I suppose the other question that you'd normally ask in these sorts of interviews is, what's next for you? And maybe it's the same answer.
I would say, tied into your last question with cancel culture, the people who are doing the canceling right now are seen as virtuous. They're seen as brave and courageous for speaking out and being a part of call-out culture. I question in some cases, I look at my colleagues who are dealing with this, and it's usually some anonymous person on social media, or in some cases, it's someone who is not as successful in their field going after someone who is very successful. I know that you had Steven Pinker on recently, and his attempted and thankfully failed cancellation attempt last year. You look at the people going after him, and in many cases, they are graduate students. From what I understand, there are some people who supposedly signed this petition, but these people, the names were not real people. So you wonder, what is the reason why they're going after someone like him? It's because he is extremely respected and very successful. And I would say to people who feel the need to partake in this culture, focus on yourself, focus on what you want to achieve with your life and your goals, put your energy toward that instead of tearing other people down. You'll be much happier. And in terms of what I'm doing next, I am launching a new project this spring I'm very excited about. So I would ask everyone to follow me on social media, sign up for my mailing list on my website, which is drdebraso.com, because of censorship on social media, to ensure that I can reach you directly.
Dr. So, thank you very much for all of this. It's not been the most sort of light of topics, but I think it's incredibly important, and I really appreciate that putting your own words back to you and the work that my committee have done on some of this. And just to point out that although there have been some critical points on here, there's also been a lot of people who are thankful for you, or at least have read your book and said, this is very different to how it was sort of portrayed. I'm sure that what you've said won't please everybody who's been watching, but I think that at the very least, we've shown that people can disagree well in these sorts of things, and that the idea of free inquiry and free speech, hopefully we managed to uphold that well today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you everybody for watching.